We take you back to our interview around this weekend, having marked the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Africa Conference of 1884, which saw European imperial powers divide Africa amongst themselves for the purposes of colonization and exploitation. We take you back to Advocate Sipho Mantula, who joins us for more as we try and get a better sense of what really happened 135 years ago as these European leaders sat around a table to set rules for Africa's colonization. And of course, before we got cut off there, it was really a question around on how we reflect on this, because it was a move that divided the continent.
Good evening, Paul, and Jumbo Africa to your viewers. Sister Paul, if you have to look at the recolonization of Africa, the new scramble of Africa is still even continue. You look at the DRC now, Congo. That's where the beginning of this meeting started in 1884 to 1885. It took all those technocrats, diplomats, lawyers, almost 104 days to map out the African continent. And we see ourselves also being a begging continent. Every time we see African leaders going to summits, being beggars. This is what happened in 1884, also in 1885, where Africans were not part of that meeting. And there were many laws that were taken of exploitation. The stealing of the land started in that conference. What I call the dehumanization of African people, particularly of the Congo, by the Belgians, started in that conference. But if you look back and to say, what should we do now? Because there's been this call of reparations. There's been this call of bringing back the land that was stolen by Europeans, because they were using a very funny legal concept, effective occupation, and saying that there was no man's land, there was no one. Hence, you will find the name Congo was called the Congo Free State. So if you look at the Berlin Conference, its repercussions, its consequences, it is that many African countries are still suffering from that colonial era and that colonial project. And hence, you find that most of African leaders are still bowing to their former colonizers.
And what does that mean for the continent as the continent tries to progress and, break away from these chains and establish economies? How do we reflect on it in that sense as we look at the challenges that parts of the continent are facing today?
You know, when you look from the continent's point of view, if the continent has to reflect, and I've said to you before, is this many summits that are happening globally, the issues of the economic revitalization of the continent through the BRICS countries, what you call the Global South, what you look at the G20, South Africa taking lead, one asks whether are African countries really honest about charging and taking these issues of what happened in 140 years ago in terms of the Berlin Conference, that some of these issues are also worthy to be taken to the ICJ. But most of the African countries have always been forgiving. But like I've said to you, for the current crisis that we see in the Sahel, with the French occupation, the current crisis we see in DRC, it is also because of the French and the Belgian colonizers. And that's how we are still struggling. And that's what was said by the founding fathers, also the founding mothers of the African unity, people like Julius Nyerere, talking about the balkanization of the African continent, that we still lack this sense of unity. We are still being divided across the cultures, the languages, what I can call the exploitation of the resources. They will still continue with divide and conquer. So what we have now is that they have left us with the remnants of the empire of parliaments, creating unjust laws, and also giving a false narrative that Europeans were the explorers, were the innovators, when actually they were barbarians. They were people who came and disrupt the African civilization. Because if we have to look back, these issues that me and you are talking about, the young people at school, they are not being taught about the Berlin Conference effects. How the Berlin Conference also continue in many African states. And I think we are still struggling with the border disputes. Remember that the Berlin Conference created what we today call the colonial demarcation. We still have countries like North Sudan, the South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somaliland, Somalia. You still have balkanization in the East Africa, where there's still conflict around the issues of land, the issues of the rivers and the waters. So these are the after effects. But I think for the Africans, a true reflection will be to charge, will be to have what I call a collective indictment against European forces and the European powers.
Yeah.
And this has been done in many forums. You'll recall in South Africa, there was a World Conference against racism. And one of the issues that came out was the reparation against slavery. Maybe we have forgotten that the crime of colonialism began with the Berlin Conference.
You touched on this quite briefly, but just perhaps expanding on the impact when it comes to the legitimizing the ideas of Africa, because it essentially became a playground for outsiders when one has to look at the mineral wealth as a resource.
No, correctly. For me, not only being the playground, but Africa also became a resource or the epicenter of the natural resources. And that was done through an act of violence. So you'll understand that we will want to use the law, will want to use transitional justice, but there was an act of violence that was used against us. And you look currently, many African countries, whether West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, we are still even caught up with our colonial currencies. That if you look at West Africa, their currency was still using the French currency, the language, economy. When you look at trade, remember that the idea was also to open trade. So the then King of Belgium lied to that conference that will want to open a free trade zone between DRC, which was then Congo, with the African continent, only to benefit himself and to kill African people for the sake of those monies and natural resources. And I think that's what we find in Africa. The issue around the mining sector, the issue around exploitation of natural resources being exploited. And that's where you find that even if you can talk of the World Bank, we talk of the IMF, it was built on that false narrative of the grand looting. Others, we are calling this a great crime that happened for many years, for almost 140 years, and it has gone unnoticed. And that's how we have to maybe find a way through the global south, how we can be equal partners. Others are talking of the word multipolar system. Maybe we need to enter into the multipolar system where the African countries are equal partners. They are not beggars. They are not going to G20 as beggars or G77 or World Bank, but we also know our position. And like I said to you, Sipho, this is the issue that has been perpetuated even through the media can tell us that Europeans have liberated us.
The consequences have indeed reverberated across the years and are still felt up until today. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening as we wrap up that discussion. Advocate Sipho Mantula giving us some clarity as we reflect on the weekend that marked the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Africa Conference of 1884.